Peter F. Drucker, considered the preeminent thought leader in the field of marketing and management, wrote 40 books on the subject. He advised organizations that ranged from General Motors, Intel, IBM, Coca-Cola, and in the nonprofit sector, the Girl Scouts, the Salvation Army, the American Red Cross, and many smaller organizations. He consulted with them to help them devise plans for not only their organization's success, serving those in their constituencies, but also raising funds so that they could continue doing what they wanted to do. He, as a consultant, had a way of looking at the processes that were important for an organization. He listed what he called 8 key result areas that included human organization, productivity, financial resources, physical resources, social responsibility, profit requirements, and then there were 2 at the very top here that were more important in his mind than all of the rest. Those were innovation and marketing. In fact, he said the organization has 2 and only 2 real purposes: innovation and marketing. All of the rest, he said, are costs. So he had what I would call a specifically imbalanced and undemocratic view about which of all of these were most important. He placed his money on innovation and marketing. These were, in his mind, what the Latin phrase conditio sine qua non means. It means the condition without which not. So those are the focuses that he had for both nonprofit and for-profit organizations alike. In my research, took advantage of being one of his students, and I asked him what he would do to examine the language of fundraising. Now, looking at the language of fundraising does nothing. It just is, in fact, like looking in a mirror. It only matters after you look in the mirror if you do something to change it. So my research looked at the largest study of its kind. It looked at 1,500,000 words from 745 organizations representing the largest ones in America. I used a routine called a statistical factor analysis, which basically counted the number of word kinds that either are very academic sounding, very interpersonal sounding, or very narrative sounding. There were 29 linguistic features that were particularly important, those that create interpersonal connection and tell a story. And so Drucker described those 8 key result areas, and in my mind, marketing was a cognate of fundraising in the nonprofit sector. And I looked at particular areas. If you look at any kind of writing, it works on 3 levels. The first being rhetorical superstructure. What do you want it to do? It's like if you were building a house, you first get an architect's rendering and the plans for all of the aspects that must go into that building. Then the second thing, when you're building a building, is the linguistic substructure and language, but the substructure for a house would be the interior design of various rooms and so forth. And the stylistic elements that are part of that. And then there's also what I call the linguistic substructure. And those are those words I mentioned earlier, 29 particular words that create either narrative or interpersonal relationships with your reader. So those 3 things were measured, and the judgment came down as we looked. So far I've mentioned principles in somewhat of an abstract form. That's what the research was about. And I noted that most fund appeals default to an academic style of language. This is the way we've grown up in school, so we tend to default to that even when we write a fund appeal. I measured the style of writing among nonprofit leaders around the country, and almost all of them wrote as if they were writing for a professor who was no longer there rather than for a donor who might be reading a letter. To illustrate a sample, let me give you just a taste of what a very dull, information-focused fund appeal might sound like. This appeal seeks to help distressed people and reminds me of the thousands that are in peril right now in Gaza. This occurred during the civil war in Guatemala. And here's an example. In Guatemala, insurgents invaded the valleys, resulting in casualties and the displacement of indigenous populations to mountain settings. Higher elevations were presumed to be adequately distanced from the combatants, forces thus minimizing threats to innocence. UN-sponsored observers were dispatched to uphold the rules of engagement, protective of non-combatants. But those observers found encampments offered inadequate protection from rebel forces, and the inclement weather at higher altitudes had a detrimental impact on the health of those who were in the camps. Well, I cherry-picked some ideas of what a letter that sounded academic might sound like. The insurgents means rebels or guerrillas. If you were to change that language to be something more evocative of what you might feel, an insurgent might be a rebel or a guerrilla. Resulted in casualties means people died. Observers, I would change that to watchdogs. Adequately distanced means safely away. Combatant forces means raiding parties. They were displaced. That means they were rushed up the mountainside to protect themselves. To uphold the urgently means to enforce. Non-combatants means the innocents, families. Inadequate protection means they virtually had no protection at all. That's why they were hiding in the mountains. Now compare that with a little bit more detail in a piece that was written by an individual I was consulting with who actually was on the ground in the melee. And she writes, one relief team had scaled steep mountainous terrain to reach the refugee camp. That day, many died in the fighting that still raged below in the valley. Many families had lost their homes, passed down across generations. They'd been seized, pillaged, and burned. Modest businesses that long had sustained families were totally gone. Livelihoods had been lost. Then I saw up close a loss that struck still deeper, wounding my soul. We come upon a group of women huddled in a circle. As we draw close, I see that they're crying. They're grieving for a young boy whose thin body, drained of life, lay in a coffin made of cardboard boxes. Their pain, now my pain, was as real as day. One woman speaks between sobs. He died because he had a sore throat. I suspected the cause had been a strep infection. Tears swell in my eyes, but I hold them in, lest I add to the terrible weight of grief that these women are already bearing. Soon after, we lie down for the night. A distant whir breaks the silence. The sound grows louder and louder as it intensifies. Panicked refugees scramble to douse fires. Suddenly, the whole village falls dark. Moments later, I see a helicopter above, lights shining on the encampment. Then suddenly, machine gun fire cuts a line in the dirt, just feet from our heads. There is no conflict-free zone, no safe place for the desperate, defenseless families fleeing terror that night. It reminded me so much of what's happening now in Gaza with many who are fleeing. One last thing I'll comment on with regard to what I just shared. Margaret Atwood, on orality and storytelling, writes, "Tell rather than write. If it's a story, even in my head, I'm telling it to someone." The idea that she is trying to communicate is that good writing is oral. It is written to express what you would say in conversation with another individual. So the battle really between good and bad writing, in my mind, is between what academic prose sounds like, which is appropriate when you're dealing with a very, very complex subject. But most fundraisers preferred narrative, but they couldn't write it. And in fact, 5% to 45 was the ratio, 99 to 1. They believed that they should write in a conversational story form, but they cannot.